There we go. Well, I just want to take a moment to welcome Melissa to the Knowledge Café today. She comes as a PhD candidate from the Department of Biostatistics, and she's going to talk about an introduction to mediation analysis. So we thank you for being here, and we welcome you to join us in any Knowledge Café in the future. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm glad that I could be here. So by the way, I just wanted to say if my audio, if there's like any issues, just let me know. Because yeah, I've had some issues in the past. Hopefully you can hear me fine through my headset, but please give me a heads up. So thank you for having me. I'm going to give an introduction today about mediation analysis with applications to epidemiology. So the talk I'll be presenting is called Understanding How in a Study of Cause and Effect, an Introduction to Mediation Analysis in Epidemiology. And I just want to mention, you're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation. This should be informal. So if you want to discuss any topics in specific, feel free to ask questions throughout or ask for clarification or anything like that. So today I'll be talking a little bit about an introduction to causal inference. I'll then discuss the potential outcomes framework and how that can be used to conceptualize the quantities that we're interested in estimating. I'll then talk about mediation analysis, and that's an area I've worked in a little bit with my current research. So I'll be sharing what my current research project is on, which is using mediation analysis to understand how basically explain the differences in rural urban disparities between cancer mortality rates. So first, I just want to give a little overview about what is causal inference. It's obviously a really huge field, but it aims at formalizing the assumptions that are needed to conclude a treatment A causes an outcome Y, and not just say that they're associated, which is often what we do using a lot of statistical methods. We're claiming associations. So this formalizes the framework. It is often applied to observational data sets. And nowadays we have access to so many huge data sets that weren't necessarily collected for experimental purposes, but that we can use in order to see if there might be a cause and effect between either a treatment, intervention, exposure, and then an outcome of interest. So some examples of observational data include electronic health records databases, insurance claims databases, since you can get information about treatments and outcomes, but it wasn't collected for that purpose, customer purchasing databases or transactions from a store, and any really prospective study where the treatment or exposure was not randomized to individuals. It was maybe assigned to them for a specific reason. So I'm going to just use the word treatment throughout, but just know that this is very broad and can basically relate to any exposure or thing that you're interested in seeing if there's a cause and effect relationship. And we're going to call the quantity of interest either a treatment effect or more broadly a causal effect. And that's what a lot of causal inference studies aim at getting at. So in medicine and epidemiology, randomized controlled trials are often considered the gold standard for establishing a cause and effect relationship. These are experiments in which a treatment is randomized to patients. So you might be looking at an experimental treatment and then a placebo and seeing how well the experimental treatment works. And usually if they're large and well designed, these are like the primary method of choice. However, these are not always feasible. So they can be really expensive or they can be unethical. For example, if you want to look at the link between smoking and lung cancer, you can't necessarily randomize people to smoke because we know that's harmful. But the aspect of randomization is a very attractive one if we're able to either do it or kind of mimic randomization. So the goal of randomization is to achieve covariate balance between groups. And this essentially means that in the two groups that you're comparing, the distributions of other important patient characteristics such as sex, age, race, health status, that they're similar so that you can essentially isolate the average treatment effect because the other covariates are balanced. And this doesn't always perfectly happen in clinical trials, but randomization greatly helps with that. And as sample size increases, on average, you're expected to have covariate balance. So when we're working with observational data, we essentially want to find ways to have covariate balance. What kind of methods can we use so that the groups are essentially similar and we can isolate the treatment effect? So this just an example of an hypothetical observational study. Say we're interested in using electronic health records to figure out whether an experimental therapy might be effective in treating late stage cancer patients versus just using the current standard of care. This therapy might be available on a compassionate use basis, which means that it has not yet received FDA approval. But in cases where someone is very sick, they might feel, for example, that the benefits outweigh the potential risks. And this is also true. This is happening with COVID-19, different therapies. So if we're looking at trying to figure out on kind of before the clinical trials finish, whether this experimental therapy has promise or not compared to a standard of care, do you think there's covariate balance between the two groups, those who get this special new drug and those who have the standard of care? Or do you think there are certain factors that might influence who receives that experimental treatment? And what factors, for example, might be different between the two groups?
So one thing is that if the patient is really sick, then we might want to try it. So it is not necessarily, a balanced cohort of patients.
Right.
Also, if the patient agrees to do that, so the person that the patient is risk taker or risk averse would affect, things like that.
Definitely. Yeah, those are two really good examples of things that might be related to the treatment assignment and potentially to the outcome as well. If they're really sick, then if we're just comparing the two groups, we might really be comparing the health status of them and not quite getting at that treatment effect. Anyone else have any other thoughts on that? Yeah, so health status could differ between groups. For example, in a compassionate use setting, you have to pay out of pocket. So maybe socioeconomic status could play a role. So just kind of when you're designing observational studies or using observational data to essentially get at a treatment effect, you need to kind of consider what other variables are important to include. Another question you have to consider is, does every patient with this type of cancer have a non-zero or positive probability of receiving this therapy? And that's an assumption in causal inference. So if there is a subset of patients in your patient population of interest who would have no chance at getting this therapy, then that violates one of the assumptions. So you kind of have to think through all of these different factors in order to decide, one, is this a feasible study? Two, what variables should I be including in order to fairly assess the difference in the treatments? And a series of causal assumptions in the book that I cited a book at the end by Hernan and Robbins can be used to conceptualize an observational study in an RCT framework. So essentially, treat it as an RCT if we're able to balance all these factors using causal methods. So more of those assumptions are kind of explained in that text. So what we were just talking about was essentially looking at confounding variables and making sure that we include them in the analysis. So in causal inference, causal diagrams are often used to kind of map out what relationships we're interested in and what variables we have to take into our analysis. So we're going to call the treatment A, and we want to see if it has an effect on the outcome Y. And in order to basically say there's a cause and not just an association between A and Y, we have to take into account any common causes. So C, for example, is both causing A because there's an arrow pointing towards it, and it's causing Y. And even if A did not cause Y at all, there would be an association there. So by accounting for C in our analysis, we can essentially estimate the effect of A on Y, if there is one, that is not due to the common cause. So it's important to kind of map out what would be considered a confounding variable and how we can incorporate it into the analysis. So now I'll talk a little bit about the potential outcomes framework. This is used to essentially conceptualize what quantities we're trying to estimate in a causal study, and it's often used to think through causal inference problems. So Y is going to denote a subject's observed outcome. And just for kind of walking through a mediation example, we're going to assume that Y is continuous. The subject, we know, either received level of treatment A equals 1 or A equals 0. So they might have been on that experimental therapy, which we could call 1, or on the standard of care, which we'll call 0. But we only observed one of these two situations and the corresponding outcome. So in causal inference, we essentially want to know what outcome would the subject have had if they were on the other treatment, as well as what outcome would they have had if they were on the treatment they actually took. So these are called potential outcomes or counterfactuals. So we denote if their outcome, had they been on treatment A equals 0, would be Y subscript 0. And then their outcome, had they been on treatment 1, would be Y subscript 1. And like I said, one of these will be considered a factual outcome because we observed it. The other is a counterfactual outcome because we did not observe it. But ideally, it would be great to know both of these so that we can essentially get at an individual patient's treatment effect. The next bullet point just kind of says that Y was observed and it's equal to either Y1 if the treatment received treatment 1 and Y0 if the treatment received treatment 0. And in causal, this is called the consistency assumption. So we're just basically saying that we know one of those and it's equal to that individual's potential outcome for that treatment. And finally, the quantity of interest often in a causal study is the treatment effect. So it would be great if we could just figure out an individual subject's treatment effect, but as we know, we didn't observe one of those outcomes. So generally, the best we can do in causal inference and a quantity that people often try to estimate is the average treatment effect or average causal effect in the whole population. So on average, did this treatment work better than the other treatment? But kind of conceptualizing it in the counterfactual framework. So this would just be the expectation of Y1 minus Y0. And in order to truly get at that quantity, there's an assumption called SUTVA, which is the stable unit treatment value assumption. So that kind of has two parts. The first part is that there can't be multiple versions of the treatment. So for example, people can't be getting like very different doses of the treatment, or else we're not going to be able to target what that quantity would be under a certain dose. The second one is that there can't be treatment interference. So one subject's treatment can't affect another subject's potential outcome. So for example, if we're looking at some sort of dieting intervention and we assign one person to a certain diet and then they live with their spouse who is assigned to the other diet, they're often cooking together. The person who was not assigned to this special diet might be eating that special diet, and we cannot basically get a correct estimate of the treatment effect if there's that interference. So that's a really big assumption in causal inference, and there are methods to kind of break out of that assumption, but what we're talking about is going to require that assumption. So that's kind of just a general overview of causal inference. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to mediation analysis, which is a more specific topic? Cool.
So
oh yeah.
I have a quick question. So so far what you've discussed is just we have two groups, either got the treatment or didn't, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so do we have methods to deal with, the dose that you said? My own research, I'm dealing with dosing a drug, so I want to see if there is methods that we can do inference using, because people can take different doses of the drug.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I just introduced the dichotomous setting, but you can look at differences in dose specifically. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that assumption was just to look at essentially. You could also apply what we just talked about to a dose of like 25 and 50 milligrams or something like that. But I do know there are methods that break out of the binary treatment setting.
I see. Okay, thank you.
All right, so now we'll talk about mediation analysis, which is something that I've worked in a bit more. So mediation analysis is aimed at understanding how a cause might cause the outcome. We likely already know that A causes Y, but we want to know, is there a certain process that it's going through to get from A to Y? So M is an intermediate outcome that we want to see if A at all changes M, that might change Y. Is this on the causal pathway? Or is this not explaining too much of the relationship between A and Y? In other words, A is directly causing Y, or it's happening through another mediator we're not looking at. So M is considered the mediator variable, and we essentially want to get at how much of the total effect of A on Y, which occurs potentially through M and not through M, how much of the total effect occurs through this mediation pathway. So this is just a motivating example. I took this example from a textbook that I also cited at the end by Vanderweel on mediation. And they introduce a study of persons with a substance use disorder, so potentially an opioid addiction, who they want to see if a rehab program with methadone, so that's treatment A, might result in increased work activity Y. So this is just a hypothetical situation that they propose, but they propose that a potential pathway from the rehab treatment or program and methadone treatment potentially affecting work activity could be due to a change in illicit drug use. So the rehab program could cause a change in level of illicit drug use, which then could cause a change in the amount of work someone is doing. So we'll also consider what other variables might impact these relationships and if we should control for them, but that's kind of the setup and something to think about. So in this setting, Y is going to be a continuous variable, M is also continuous, and then we once again have a binary treatment. So either someone underwent the rehab program or they did not. So mediation analysis takes that potential outcomes framework that we originally talked about and extends it a little bit further. So Y1 and Y0 are once again the counterfactual outcomes for a subject when taking treatment 1 and treatment 0. But in addition, we need to look at what values the mediator variable would have taken under treatment 1 and under treatment 0. So the potential outcomes in this case would be M0 is equal to the mediator value had the subject taken treatment 0, and M1 is that value had they taken treatment 1. Once again, we only observed one of these two situations, so we don't have this information for each person. We then also are looking at counterfactual outcomes that depend on both the mediator variable, MA, as well as the treatment. So YAMA is the counterfactual outcome. Had you fixed the subject's treatment at level A, and then had you fixed the subject's mediator value at the value it would have taken under treatment A. You could also write YAMA star. So now their mediator value might be fixed at a different treatment level, but the treatment that they are truly receiving is A. And we're going to look at how a few of these different quantities are used in mediation analysis. So in order to kind of come up with a causal interpretation versus just saying we have an association, like I said, we need to incorporate confounding variables into our analysis. So C is going to represent a collection of confounders, and different confounders can confound the relationship between these different variables. So there might be, say, 3 variables that we're including in our analysis. So if A is the rehab plus methadone treatment, M is the level of illicit drug use, and Y is the work activity, can anyone think of potentially a variable that might impact any of these relationships? So maybe a variable that might impact the level of illicit drug use and cause a change in work activity.
Yeah, maybe like location or age. I don't know.
Definitely.
Like friends.
Definitely, yeah. So if you include potentially someone's location or neighborhood that they're living in into the analysis, that could definitely be a cause of both illicit drug use as well as work activity, or who they're spending time with. So any of these quantities that we're able to measure, and we feel that do have a cause and effect relationship on any two of these variables, we do need to include into the analysis. So just kind of brainstorming what potential variables might also impact this relationship, so that we're truly explaining the cause of A on Y through M, and it's not due to any other associations. So we're
Melissa,
yes.
Quick question.
Yep.
If you're using an observational data set, then you're obviously limited on what you know about the participants.
Definitely.
And so do you just, like, what kind of techniques do you use to determine which of those extra variables to add into the confounding variables? Or do you add them all in and then have some removal process? Or what generally, how do you decide that?
Yeah, so there are ways to do a sensitivity analysis to see, like, am I missing an important variable or not? Those are detailed. I actually don't know too much about them, but they are detailed in one of the books.
No problem.
Yeah.
You can continue.
But a lot of it is subject matter expertise in causal inference and drawing those diagrams. So working with someone maybe like I'm don't know a ton about epidemiology. It's an area of interest to mine, but I also work with an epidemiologist when coming up with these diagrams to incorporate subject matter expertise. But yeah, there are methods for sensitivity to see, like, are these assumptions reasonable or not when I'm including those variables. All right. Thank you all for your questions. They're all great. So once we have the causal diagram, we essentially generally want to compute three different quantities. So the first quantity is the average total effect. And this is essentially the average difference in outcome when the treatment is set to 1 versus 0. So kind of going back here, it represents both the effect through this pathway from A to M to Y, as well as the effect from A to Y. It sums both of those up. So the average total effect, we can then decompose into the average natural direct effect and the average natural indirect effect. And like I said, they sum up to the total. The average natural direct effect is essentially getting at the pathway that does not go through M. So what it's doing is essentially saying, we're looking at the difference in outcome when the treatment is 1 versus 0, but the mediator variable is held constant at what it would have been under treatment 0. So we're not changing the mediator at all. We are fixing it at that value. And then the average natural indirect effect is essentially changing the mediator value. So it's saying we want to know the difference if the mediator went from was what it would be under treatment 0 to what it would be under treatment 1. But we're going to assume that the treatment is set to 1 and we're not adjusting that. So then we're essentially just going through this pathway, having a change in M, and then seeing how that change in M is related to the outcome. So like I mentioned, we have to consider all of these confounding variables. And we kind of looked at how the arrows on the chart are explaining some of these assumptions, but I wanted to put them in to formalize it. So conditioning on C, or including C in the analysis, the first assumption is that there's no unmeasured confounding between the outcome and the treatment. So that's essentially saying on this diagram, we have any potential confounders, and there's an arrow pointing from C to A and C to Y. If it's a common cause of both of them, we need to include it in the analysis. Assumption 2 is that conditional on A and C, there is no unmeasured confounding between the mediator and the outcome. So we look at the outcome Y and we see that, we want to make sure that any variable C that point to both M and that point to Y are included in our analysis because they're both common causes. The third one is just making sure there's no unmeasured confounding between M and Y. Oh yeah, sorry, I think I made a mistake on the last one. That should have been, outcome and mediator. The mediator and the treatment. Sorry, I think I called them the wrong things. But basically this assumption is saying nothing between M and A. So you want to make sure that if there's a cause that affects both A and M, that you're including it. And the final assumption is a little harder to conceptualize and also a little harder to verify. But it's basically saying that if you include C in the analysis, A does not cause some effect. So say we could add another arrow, A pointing to L, which would be an effect L, that in turn has arrows pointing to M and Y. So essentially what it's saying is that the causal pathway from A to Y is through M, and there's no other variable that it is causing, that then in turn has an effect on M and Y. And that one's a little harder to verify and also a little harder to wrap your head around. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the SUTVA assumption applies here. So that assumption had said that there can't be different doses that we're all considering a treatment of A equals 1. And then the other assumption there is that the treatment, there's no treatment interference. So those are both very important still.
Hey, Melissa, quick
Yes.
question.
Yes.
So is assumption 4 kind of saying that there's no second mediator L?
You can have multiple mediators, but you have to take them into account in a different way in the analysis. So yeah, that's kind of as far as I know on that. I know that if you're not appropriately accounting for that, then it can mess up how much of the effect is being, it can mess up your estimates of the indirect effect.
But then I guess based on the wording, L would be unmeasured and unknown, kind of like?
L, yeah, generally, yeah. So we're not including L in the analysis. It might be unmeasured. And we need to make sure that, I think if we include it, it would be okay. You might just have to take into account, since L causes M, it's like a sequential kind of process. And I'm not sure if you can use this exact method in a sequential setting. All right, so in order to calculate the direct and indirect effects, we can use methods that we've seen before, so regression-based approaches. So the regression-based approaches work if both all of those assumptions are met and the assumptions that you would normally have in a regression model are also met. So you can't have a misspecified model. That's another way in which it could affect your estimates. But in order to use this regression-based approach, we essentially run two different models. So the first model regresses Y on all of the variables with arrows pointing towards Y. So that would be M, A, and C. And in that regression, we can essentially get estimates to compute the expected value of Y given all of those values. And in addition, we have a coefficient for A, we have a coefficient for M, and then we also include an interaction term. And if we don't have an interaction between the exposure and the outcome, we might not need to include that, but it's usually recommended that you do include it because it can bias your natural indirect effect estimate if you don't account for this potential interaction. So that's important. You could kind of run the models both ways. And if the effect size on this is very small, you might not need to include it. But this allows for you to account for that interaction if it's there. In the next equation, we are interested in looking at how M, the expectation of M, given that we know A, which points to M, and then C, which points to M. So in this case, we're just simply including the exposure as well as any potential confounders and seeing what that expectation would be. So we just essentially run two linear regression models incorporating these variables, and we can use the outcome to obtain the direct and indirect and total effects. So here's oh, I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Oh, sorry. A quick question before we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the common method to check the conditions then? So for this part, you do regression, but before that, you have to meet conditions. What is the regular method that people use to see if the conditions are met?
So for example, in terms of like making sure that these regression models are correctly specified.
No, before that, the conditions for, you know, this model, the mediation analysis, the 4 or 5 conditions that you said.
Oh, the assumptions.
Assumptions, yeah, sorry.
So like I said, some of them are based on just incorporating your subject matter expertise, but there are methods for sensitivity analysis to see, am I had I excluded an important confounder, how much would my results change? And how much would it change the effects? So I don't have expertise in sensitivity analysis, but I will say that there are methods documented there's a really good mediation analysis book by Tyler Vanderweel that I referenced at the end that will go into more detail about like actually checking those conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Melissa, I have another question.
Yeah.
So you use the interaction term AM here, and I'm just wondering why you don't use like the interaction term CA when you're regressing on M, or like why there aren't other interactions taken into play here, because the diagram makes it seem like there's additional interactions.
Yeah, that's a good question. So see the diagram, the arrows don't correspond to an interaction. They just cause it. There could be an interaction, and the interactions actually aren't shown in the diagram. Since the primary goal is to measure the effect of A through M to Y, if we don't account for the AM interaction, it really could have a substantial effect on understanding how much is mediated through there. I actually haven't seen any examples where there is an interaction with the confounder, but there is a process called moderation where you're trying to look at if an outside variable is essentially changing the effect size of A on Y. I didn't talk about that there, but I know there's more, there are methods that handle that too.
Okay, that's fine. I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah. So these represent equations for the natural direct effect and how you can calculate them, as well as the natural indirect effect. The final solution is just based on how this model is specified. So for example, if you included any additional interactions, these direct effects might change, but I think it would be possible to include additional interactions if they were there. So as you can see, if we weren't using linear models, we could still use these equations in order to get a different natural direct effect, but these kind of final solutions only holds with the 2 linear models. So just something to note, like the natural indirect effect can also be obtained in this setting by essentially plugging in the expectation of M given A and C into M in the equation above. And as you can see, it's just theta 2 times beta 1 plus theta 3 times beta 1. So anything that has an A in it, it's just essentially the coefficient in front of A. So that's kind of nice that you can just plug in the expectation of M and get this natural indirect effect. That won't always hold, but in this setting, it does hold. And if there truly is no interaction, theta 3 will be 0. So then the natural indirect effect is just this nice product term, the beta 1 times theta 2, which is nice and simple. So just in terms of causally interpreting these effects, when using the regression models, and if all of those assumptions I mentioned are truly satisfied, then we can say that A causes Y or A causes Y through M, for example. But in practice, there's very few papers that say like we determined that A causes Y, because we're not necessarily meeting all of those assumptions. We're doing our best, but a lot of papers still use like we found a strong link between them, or like evidence suggesting it may cause, but it's really hard to meet all of those assumptions. And you might not have in your database, you might not have the best variable to measure the outcome, or that confounds the relationship. Like it might have measurement error. There's a lot of different reasons why these could be these assumptions could be violated. So just when interpreting it as a causal effect, still use caution when saying that you have a causal effect. In addition, like I said, some of these assumptions can be tested with sensitivity analysis. So you can kind of see if I am missing a really important variable that I didn't think about, how much would these natural direct and indirect effects change? So that can be kind of nice to see, you know, if there's not too much variability in those, then you might be doing okay with the assumptions. But you do have to think really carefully about using the word cause, even in causal inference, which we're trying to get at that. And I think finally, a quantity of interest would be figuring out how much mediation actually occurred. So one measure for doing that is the proportion mediated. And essentially what that does, it just looks at the natural indirect effect, or the pathway through M, divided by the total effect in order to see what percentage was explained through the natural indirect effect. So this is one technique. There are others that can be used. But as long as your natural direct effect and natural indirect effect have like the same sign, it might be okay. If one's positive and one's negative, this number might not make a lot of sense, and that can sometimes happen. So a couple limitations are that it can't be used in every case. And a second limitation is that it might have a wide confidence interval. So it can kind of just give you an overall sense of how much mediation occurred. But there are other methods that can be used to look at how much mediation occurred. And then there's a couple ways to do this in both the frequentist and Bayesian setting. Is anyone doing Bayesian research right now?
Not now.
Okay.
Interested.
Cool. Yeah. Well, so mediation analysis, I'll just kind of give a brief overview of how it works in both cases. So how I explained it was the frequentist approach, which is probably what everyone has the most exposure to. But in my personal opinion, I like the Bayesian approach better. It's a little easier to get the quantities. So in the frequentist setting, we can obtain estimates of each of these effects by running the regression models and then plugging in the estimated regression coefficients to calculate these values. The thing that's a little bit harder is obtaining the standard error so that you can make a confidence interval for these values. And the easiest way to do it is to use bootstrapping, especially when these methods get more complicated or your models include more interactions and confounders, or they're not linear. Bootstrapping is often the best way to obtain a confidence interval in this setting. So that can be a little bit computationally intensive, but that's kind of the way to go. The Bayesian setting, just to give a little Bayesian background, in Bayesian modeling, we're interested in incorporating prior information into the model about the parameters, and we're interested in modeling the data. And then the outcome of that model is basically a posterior distribution, which is the probability of certain parameters given your data. So it's essentially your beliefs now that you've incorporated the data into the model. This can be a little bit easier in this case. So if you run the Bayesian version of a linear regression model, you have to specify prior distributions or incorporate any prior information you have on the parameters. But you could just say, I don't really know what the values are, so I'm going to center my distribution at 0 and just have a really wide variance. And then you obtain posterior samples of each of these quantities, which are pretty easy to get at once you've specified the model in general. And after that, you can use the posterior mean as well as create a 95% credible interval by just taking quantiles of your samples. So I won't go into too much detail about that, but I did link readings that kind of go through the Bayesian process in a lot more detail if that's something that people are interested in, because I'm a personal fan of that approach. Let's see. Whoa. Sorry, my screen is not switching. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so that's kind of like the introduction that I had to mediation analysis. Does anyone have other questions about the setting that we discussed? All right, so I just wanted to briefly share what my research is about. It's a slightly different mediation setting than the one that we discussed. And I'll just kind of talk about some of the challenges and considerations that we have for this project, because this is actually something I'm working on right now, and we have not derived all of the quantities that we're interested in yet. But the main goal of our project is basically in my dissertation research, I'm focused on spatiotemporal modeling of mortality rates for cancer at the county level. So I use Bayesian hierarchical models to do that. And in the Midwest, there are differences, rural-urban differences. So for some cancers, the age-adjusted mortality rate is higher for rural areas than it is for urban areas. Especially, for example, if you look at these estimates that we got from running some preliminary models, for colorectal cancer, the age-adjusted rate is on average 9.3% higher for rural areas compared to urban. And the credible interval does not include 1. So this does seem like a pretty significant difference, and it ranges from 6.4% to 12.2%. We also looked at lung cancer, and the credible interval did include 1. So we may or may not work with that. And then all cancer mortality as well had a lower bound that was just a little bit greater than 1. So I think colorectal was the one that had the largest differences. But we do want to understand what about rural or urban status is related to cancer mortality rate. So how can this difference be explained? So we are using a mediation analysis to see what variables mediate the relationship. And in this case, we're treating the treatment or exposure as rural or urban. So it's a binary exposure. And then the outcome is going to be age-adjusted cancer mortality rates. So I'm working on this research with Dr. Jake Olson and Dr. Mary Charlton. And we're using a Bayesian spatial model for this because we have to use information from nearby counties as well as the county of interest to get good estimates of rates, because often there's not that many cancer cases in a given county. So we need to leverage the information and the fact that there's similarities between geographic areas. So in this setting, like I said, A is now going to be our exposure or treatment. So we're saying A equals 1 is rural and A equals 0 is urban. One of the variables we wanted to examine was the miles to the nearest Commission on Cancer accredited hospital. So now instead of thinking of a person as our subject, we're now thinking of the county as our subject. And we want to see if distance to a hospital at all explains the link between rurality of a county and the age-adjusted cancer mortality rate. So is healthcare access playing a role? We obviously want to include more mediators in our model, but we're still trying to derive it for a single mediator setting, so we're working up to that. And we're right now just focusing on the association between A and Y. So as of now, we're not looking at confounders, but we're also not going to try to draw a causal interpretation. So this is what our Bayesian hierarchical model looks like. Without going into a ton of details, some of the main differences from our original example that we were working through is that now our outcome Y is going to be a count outcome. So we're working with a Poisson regression instead of a linear regression model. In addition, if you look at the second stage, where this is just modeling each age group and county separately. So now if lambda over n is the rate for that county, and each county has, each age group has a separate intercept. We have a coefficient for rural. We have a coefficient for miles to the nearest cancer hospital. And then we also have this interaction, which we actually find really important in this setting because people in rural communities are more likely to drive and be okay with driving further distances than urban. My advisor worked on a paper related to that, and there were differences in how just perception of distance for rural versus urban. And then we have a spatial random effect, and that's now essentially saying that all of these outcomes are correlated, which we also didn't have before. And if you've worked with Poisson models at all, you have to account for over dispersion. So we have a term to do that. So basically the key differences here is that now we have a count outcome, we have spatial correlation, and then we have we want to include potential mediators, but right now this is only including one. We then have a second model, and this is just going to be a Bayesian version of a linear regression. So now the outcome is just, we're going to treat it as miles to the nearest hospital, and then our variable is going to be the rural or urban status of a county. And then I just wanted to talk through some of the challenges that we have right now and why we can't use the exact framework that I had explained before. So we think that the assumption SOTFA is violated, which is that treatment interference assumption. Because, for example, a county's rural or urban status likely influences cancer mortality rate, and a neighboring county, if that county's urban, but the county we're looking at is rural, there might be different resources in the urban county that could affect the rural county's outcome. So we kind of are trying to conceptualize this as thinking about like interference in a social network, for example. And there's recent work on how to basically get estimates of treatment effects when you have either spatial interference or interference on a social network. So there's a paper from this year where someone does this for a social network, which is pretty interesting if anyone does network research. And then with the count outcome, the direct and indirect effects change a bit, because if you remember those integrals, we have different distributions that we're inputting now. So we're going to get different effects. And then for multiple mediators, especially correlated ones, we have to run additional models. And we may or may not be able to determine how much of the indirect effect is related to one mediator. We might only be able to say like all these mediators together are essentially explaining the relationship between rural and urban. So that's just a little introduction to what I'm currently working on, and I don't have results because I'm in the middle of it. But yeah, I think that is everything I was going to talk about. Just want to acknowledge the data set as well as my funding source. And then I put in some references on each of these topics if anyone's interested in something specifically, because I know I didn't talk about a lot of them in detail. So yeah, please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Melissa. Does anybody have any questions?
Just a question suggestion. So do you have any contacts in business analytics department, faculty working, with them or getting consultant from? Because part of the things that you're doing, the spatial part, this Shinzhou is our expert in spatial analysis, and, Kang Zhao is our expert in social media analytics, things like social network analytics. So what you're doing is pretty awesome, interesting, really, I liked it. And just, in case you needed any kind of, help from people, there are people in our department that could, help you as you did today for us.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I will definitely look into their backgrounds. And I think all of this is so interdisciplinary. So it's really cool to have the opportunity to talk about it across disciplines. And I'm sure some of the applications, I know I spoke about EPI, but I'm curious to hear if any of you do work in this, what your applications are, because yeah, there's a lot of really cool ways to connect our fields.
And I do remember that Nick Street, of course, it should have been, 10, 15 years ago, had some research on, they wanted to see whether mortality rating of different hospitals in Iowa, they wanted to somehow adjust the score that different hospitals get, because people who are sicker go to, UIHC, people are not that sick, go to other universities, so mortality rate changes. So it had this spatial component, and also, the inference component. So they had to do counterfactual as well. So
That
that's
sounds really
something
cool.
that is close to your work,
Yeah,
but
he focused only on
yours, what's that?
Dr. Street's paper. It focuses only on cardiac surgery cabbage, I think, and he used distance to hospital as a feature to avoid some of this,
Yeah.
SUTV assumption violations. But obviously, the variable is continuous in a sense, distance to the hospital.
Hmm. I'll
Right.
definitely have to check out that work. That sounds pretty related to what I am working on right now. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you for the good presentation. I've been looking forward to learning about causal inference, but I'm too lazy to do so. So someone
Well, thank you for coming. And I will also just put a plug for it. If I think Mike Jones will be teaching the causal inference course in our department, I want to say next fall. So if anyone is interested in learning more, a lot of what I learned is from that course. And I recommend you check it out. There's a lot more detail about some of these topics. And yeah, it's a really cool topic that I'm just starting to learn about. So
nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, if no one has any more questions, Melissa, thank you for joining us. You're welcome, and whoever else is here is obviously welcome to join us in the future. So if there's anything that you would be interested in hearing about, contact the executive team. I don't know if we have any Knowledge Cafe set up, but I know it's being worked on. So hopefully we can get those in the future. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
How do I find out
Thank you
more
for
information? Do you guys have like a website or something?
Twitter. We have a Twitter. But you're welcome to also join our listserv if you want.
I guess if you email, Sarah Powell, she would be able to give you some links and connections.
Yeah, you can email me and I'll get you on the list and send you the Twitter information.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. You're actually the person that I got Melissa's thing today about. Sorry, that was confusing. Cool, thanks.
Thank you.